The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before Jack Morrison, its red sand shimmering under the merciless afternoon sun. His horse, a weathered Mustang named Buck, plodded forward with the patience of an animal accustomed to hardship. Jack's hat brim cast a shadow over eyes that had seen too much eyes. That belonged to a man who'd learned that solitude was safer than trust. 3 days had passed since he'd left the last trading post, and his water was running dangerously low. The jerky in his saddlebag represented his final meal, but Jack had survived worse. He'd been riding alone for 7 years now, ever since the war ended and he'd returned to find his ranch burned and his family gone. The desert had become his home, and loneliness his only companion. Buck's ears suddenly perked forward, and Jack's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip. In this territory, vigilance meant survival. Apache raids had been increasing lately, and most settlers avoided this particular stretch of canyon country. But Jack Morrison feared nothing anymore. He had nothing left to lose. A faint whimpering sound carried on the hot wind, barely audible above Buck's hoofbeats. Jack reined in his horse and listened intently. There it was again, weak, desperate, human. Following the sound, Jack guided Buck around a cluster of red rocks and found him, a small Apache boy, no more than 8 years old, collapsed in the meager shade of a stunted juniper tree. The child's ribs showed through his bronzed skin, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. Dark hair matted with dust framed a face that should have been full of life, but instead showed the hollow emptiness of starvation. Jack dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground. The boy's eyes fluttered open large, dark pools filled with resignation rather than fear. He'd accepted death, Jack realized. This child had given up hope. "Easy there, boy," Jack said softly, crouching down but maintaining his distance. He'd learned enough Apache words during his time in this territory to attempt communication. "Shakiz," he said, "friend." The boy's eyes widened slightly. Jack reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his last piece of jerky, tough and salty but nourishing. Without hesitation, he tore it in half, keeping the smaller portion for himself and extending the larger piece toward the child. "Ache, Jack said, using the Apache word for food he'd picked up from traders. The boy stared at the offered meat, confusion flickering across his young features. White men and Apache were enemies, everyone knew this. Yet here was a cowboy, alone and vulnerable, sharing his last meal. Slowly, trembling fingers reached out and accepted the jerky. Jack watched as the boy devoured the food with desperate hunger, then offered his water canteen. The child drank deeply, some of the color returning to his cheeks. As Jack helped him sit up against the tree, he noticed the boy wore a small leather pouch around his neck, clearly something of significance. "What's your name, son?" Jack asked gently, though he doubted the boy understood English. "Nalnish," the child whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack nodded respectfully. "I'm Jack. Jack Morrison." He pointed to himself, then gestured around the empty landscape. "Where's your family, your people?" Nalnish's eyes filled with tears, and he pointed weakly toward the eastern canyon walls. In broken English mixed with Apache, he conveyed a tragic tale. His family's small band had been attacked by Mexican slavers 3 days ago. He'd hidden in the rocks as his parents were killed and his sister taken. He'd been wandering the desert alone ever since, slowly dying of hunger and thirst. Jack felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he'd buried deep after losing his own family. This boy was alone, just as he was. An orphan, just as he was. But unlike Jack, who'd chosen solitude, this child had loneliness thrust upon him. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Jack made a decision that surprised even him. "You're coming with me?" he said firmly. "Can't leave you out here to die." Nalnish looked up at him with eyes that held a flicker of hope for the first time. Jack helped the boy to his feet and boosted him up onto Buck's back, then swung up behind him. As they rode toward a sheltered alcove Jack had spotted earlier, neither of them realized that they were being watched. High above on the canyon rim, a young Apache scout named Hashki had witnessed the entire encounter through his father's field glasses, a gift from a trading post. What he'd seen defied everything he'd been taught about white men. This cowboy, this man who should have been an enemy, had shared his last food and water with an Apache child without hesitation. Hashki turned his horse and rode hard toward the east, toward the hidden canyon where Chief Nash and his warriors were camped. This news would change everything. As darkness fell over the desert, Jack built a small fire in the rocky alcove, using dried juniper wood that would produce minimal smoke. Nalnish sat close to the warmth, still weak but visibly stronger after the food and water. Jack shared his remaining jerky equally between them, though his own stomach cramped with hunger. "Why?" Nalnish asked in halting English, his young face serious in the firelight. Jack stared into the flames, thinking of his own childhood, his own losses. "Because," he said quietly, "everybody deserves a chance, and because it's the right thing to do." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding more than his years should have allowed. As Jack settled down to sleep with his rifle across his lap, Nalnish curled up near the dying fire. For the first time in 3 days, the child felt safe. Neither of them slept deeply, but for different reasons. Jack's ingrained caution kept him alert to every sound, while Nalnish found himself studying this strange white man who'd shown him kindness when he expected only death. In the morning, Jack had promised they would ride to the nearest settlement where the boy could find help. But morning would bring changes neither of them could have imagined. Dawn crept slowly across the canyon floor, painting the red rocks in soft pastels before the harsh light of day would bleach them pale. Jack stirred from his light sleep, immediately alert as years of frontier life had trained him to be. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and morning chill bit through his worn leather jacket. Nalnish was still sleeping, curled up like a small animal seeking warmth. In the growing light, Jack could see the boy more clearly, the proud line of his jaw despite his youth, the way he slept with one hand on the leather pouch around his neck. This child had warrior blood, Jack realized. Apache blood that had produced some of the finest fighters the frontier had ever known. As Jack quietly began preparing for the day ahead, his mind turned to practical matters. The nearest settlement was Fort Huachuca, still 2 days' hard ride south. He had no food left, barely enough water for one person, let alone two. But he'd given his word to the boy, and Jack Morrison's word still meant something, even in this godforsaken country where honor seemed as scarce as water. Nalnish awakened as the sun crested the canyon rim, sitting up immediately with the alertness of a child who'd learned that danger could come at any moment. His dark eyes found Jack, and a small smile crossed his face, perhaps the first genuine expression of happiness he'd felt since the tragedy that had left him orphaned. "Good morning, Nalnish," Jack said, offering the boy a drink from his canteen. "We'll start riding soon. Get you somewhere safe." The boy accepted the water gratefully, then spoke in his native language before switching to English. "Jack... why white man help Apache boy? Your people and my people." He gestured with his hands, indicating conflict. Jack paused in checking Buck's saddle, considering how to answer. "People are people," he said finally. "Good and bad in every color. I've known white men who'd steal from their own mothers, and I've heard tell of Apache warriors who showed mercy to enemies. Color of a man's skin doesn't tell you what's in his heart." Nalnish nodded thoughtfully, processing this wisdom. "My grandfather, he say same thing. He say some white men have good spirit." The boy's voice grew sad. "Grandfather gone now. Mexican men taken too." Jack felt anger kindle in his chest, not at the boy or his people, but at the senseless violence that had torn apart this child's world. Mexican slavers were a plague on both Apache and white settlements, caring nothing for anything but profit. They were the real enemy here, not each other. As they prepared to mount Buck, Nalnish suddenly stiffened, his head cocked to one side like a wild animal sensing danger. "Horses," he whispered urgently. "Many horses." Jack's hand moved to his Colt, and he strained to listen. At first, he heard nothing but the wind through the rocks. Then, gradually, he became aware of it, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, approaching from multiple directions. "Hide," Jack commanded, pushing Nalnish toward a cluster of boulders. But the boy shook his head firmly. "No hide," Nalnish said with quiet dignity. "If Apache come, they my people. If white soldiers come ... He shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a child who'd already faced death once. The sound grew louder, and Jack realized with growing alarm that they were surrounded. Whatever was coming, escape was no longer an option. He checked his rifle, made sure his Colt was loose in its holster, and waited. The first rider appeared on the canyon rim directly above them, an Apache warrior painted for war, eagle feathers in his black hair, carrying a rifle that caught the morning sunlight. Then another appeared to the left and another to the right. Within moments, the entire rim of their small alcove was lined with mounted Apache warriors. Jack had never seen so many in one place. There had to be dozens, no, hundreds of them. More kept appearing until the canyon walls bristled with armed men. Buck shifted nervously beneath him, sensing the tension, and Jack laid a calming hand on his horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though whether he was talking to his horse or himself wasn't clear. Nalnish stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Apache to the warriors above. Jack couldn't understand the words, but he caught the tone: respectful, urgent, explanatory. Several of the warriors responded, their voices carrying clearly in the thin desert air. One rider began making his way down the steep canyon wall, his horse picking its way carefully over the rocky terrain. He was older than the others, Jack could see, with gray threading through his long black hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. He wore the bearing of authority. This was clearly a chief or war leader of significant importance. As the Apache leader reached the canyon floor and approached their position, Jack fought every instinct that screamed at him to draw his weapon. He was outnumbered by hundreds to one. Fighting would mean death for both him and the boy. His only chance was to remain calm and hope that whatever was happening here could be resolved without bloodshed. The chief dismounted and walked toward them with measured steps, his dark eyes never leaving Jack's face. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped and spoke in accented but clear English. "You are Jack Morrison," he said. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded slowly, confused by how this man could know his name. "I am." "And you are?" "I am Chief Naish," the Apache leader replied with grave dignity. "Son of Cochise, leader of the Chiricahua Apache." He gestured toward Nalnish. "This boy, he is my sister's grandson. He is precious to our people." Understanding began to dawn on Jack, though he still couldn't comprehend the full scope of what was happening. "I found him dying in the desert," he said carefully. "Shared what food and water I had. Was planning to take him to Fort Huachuca, find someone to care for him." Chief Naish's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes held depths that Jack couldn't fathom. "Our scout, Husky, he watched you yesterday. He saw you give your last food to a starving Apache child. He saw you offer water when you had little. He saw you take this boy under your protection when you could have ridden away." The chief took another step closer, and Jack tensed despite himself. But Naish's next words were not what he expected. "In our way, when a man saves the life of one of our people, especially a child, a debt of honor is created. This debt can only be repaid with a life." The chief's eyes were steady, unwavering. "You saved the life of Nalnish. Now we owe you a life." Jack glanced around at the hundreds of warriors watching from above, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening here. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly. "I just did what any decent man would do." "Perhaps," Chief Nate replied, "but you are not any man. You are the man who chose compassion over fear, generosity over selfishness. You treated my sister's grandson not as an enemy, but as a human being deserving of help." The chief's voice carried a weight of absolute conviction. This creates a bond that cannot be broken. As the morning sun climbed higher, Jack found himself standing at the center of something far larger than he'd ever imagined, a moment where two worlds collided not in violence, but in unexpected understanding. The loneliness that had been his companion for 7 years suddenly felt less absolute, replaced by something he couldn't yet name. But he was about to discover that Chief Nate had plans that would challenge everything Jack thought he knew about honor, debt, and the possibility of redemption in a hostile world. The silence stretched between Jack and Chief Nate while hundreds of Apache warriors watched from the canyon rim. Jack could feel the weight of their collective gaze, could sense the tension coiled in every mounted figure above them. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and this encounter could explode into violence that would leave him dead and the boy orphaned once again. Chief Nate raised his hand, and immediately the warriors on the rim began descending into the canyon. They moved with practiced precision, their horses navigating the treacherous rocky slopes as if they were level ground. Jack watched in amazement as more and more riders appeared. This wasn't just a war party, it was an entire army. 500, Chief Nate said, noting Jack's expression. "Every warrior who could be spared from defending our families has come here this morning." 500? Jack's voice came out rougher than he intended. "All for one starving boy?" "Not for one boy," the chief corrected gently. "For the man who saved one boy. For the white man who looked past the color of skin and saw only a child in need." Nate gestured to Nalnish, who had moved to stand beside his great uncle with quiet dignity. "Nalnish told us what you shared with him. Your last food, your water, your protection." As the warriors filled the canyon floor around them, Jack began to understand the true scope of what was happening. These weren't random raiders or a hunting party. They were the finest fighters of one of the most feared Apache bands on the frontier, all gathered to honor a debt to a lone cowboy who'd shown kindness to a child. "My young scout Hashki," Chief Nate continued, indicating a lean warrior who'd positioned his horse nearby, "he watched you through the night. He saw how you shared your blanket when the boy grew cold, how you gave him the larger portion of water this morning, how you spoke to him with respect, not as a conquered enemy, but as a person deserving of dignity." Jack felt uncomfortable under such scrutiny, such praise. Any decent man would have done the same. Would they? Chief Nate's eyes held depths of experience that spoke of countless encounters with white men, most of them violent, few of them decent. "In 20 years of war with your people, how many white men do you think have shared their last meal with a starving Apache child?" The question hung in the air unanswered because they all knew the truth. Jack had done something extraordinary not because it required exceptional courage or skill, but because it required something far rarer, simple human compassion. One of the warriors rode forward, an older man with scars across his chest and arms that told stories of many battles. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Chief Nate, gesturing toward Jack with what seemed like approval. "Mangus says you have the heart of a true warrior," the chief translated. "Not because you carry weapons, but because you have honor. He says you fight the hardest battle of all, the battle against indifference to suffering." Jack looked at the scarred warrior, then at the hundreds of Apache fighters surrounding them, and felt the strangest sensation of being understood by people he'd been taught to consider enemies. These men knew war, knew violence, knew what it meant to survive in a harsh land, and they recognized something in his simple act of kindness that transcended the racial hatred that had divided their peoples. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. Chief Nate smiled for the first time, and his weathered face transformed. Now, Jack Morrison, you must choose. We have discussed this through the night, the war leaders and elders. You have earned a place among us if you wish it, not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity, but as a brother. The debt of honor extends to you our protection, our friendship, our respect. The offer hit Jack like a physical blow. In 7 years of wandering, he'd belonged nowhere, trusted no one, found kinship with nothing but the desert wind and his faithful horse. Now these Apache warriors men he'd been conditioned to fear were offering him something he'd thought lost forever, a family. "Or," the chief continued, "if you choose to continue your lonely path, we will escort you safely to whatever destination you name. The debt will be considered paid, and you will always be welcome in any Apache camp." Nalnish looked up at Jack with eyes that held more wisdom than any 8-year-old should possess. "Stay with us, Jack," he said in English, then repeated the plea in Apache for his people to hear. "You saved me. Let me save you from loneliness." The words struck deeper than any arrow could have. This child, who'd lost everything, was offering to share what little he had, the love and protection of his people. Jack felt something breaking inside his chest. Some wall he'd built around his heart after the war had taken everything from him. He looked around at the assembled warriors, at Chief Nache's patient face, at young Nalnish whose life he'd saved with nothing more than a piece of jerky and some water. These people understood loss. They'd been fighting for their survival, their way of life, their very existence for decades. Yet they'd found room in their hearts for compassion, for honor, for the recognition of goodness wherever it appeared. I need time to think," Jack said honestly. "This isn't what I expected when I woke up this morning." Chief Nache nodded with understanding. A wise man considers carefully before choosing his path. "We will make camp here for the day. Rest, eat, speak with our people. Learn who we are beyond the stories your newspapers tell." As if responding to some unspoken signal, the warriors began dismounting and setting up a temporary camp in the canyon. Jack watched in fascination as a small city sprang up around him, cooking fires, horse lines, weapons being cleaned and checked. But there was no sense of threat directed toward him, no hostility. Instead, several warriors approached him with curious but friendly expressions, offering food and drink. An elderly Apache woman appeared seemingly from nowhere, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. She smiled at Jack and spoke rapidly in Apache, pressing a bowl of stew into his hands and gesturing for him to eat. "She says you're too thin," Chief Nache translated with amusement. "She's Nalnish's great-grandmother. She wants to fatten you up before you waste away to nothing." Jack accepted the food gratefully, realizing that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. As he ate, warriors gathered around him, and through a mixture of broken English, Apache words he was learning, and gestures, they began to share stories. Tales of hunts, of battles, of family life in the hidden canyons where the Apache made their homes. What struck Jack most was how similar these men were to the cowboys and soldiers he'd known. They laughed at the same kinds of jokes, worried about the same things: their families, their futures, whether they'd have enough food for winter. They were simply men trying to protect their way of life in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. As the day wore on, Jack found himself drawn deeper into conversations, into this community that had formed around him. Nalnish stayed close, translating when needed, his young face glowing with happiness at seeing his rescuer accepted by his people. But as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jack knew he would soon have to make the most important decision of his life. Stay with these people who'd shown him more genuine acceptance in one day than he'd experienced in 7 years of wandering, or return to the lonely trail that had been his only companion since the war. The choice would define not just his future, but the kind of man he wanted to be. As evening shadows crept across the canyon floor, Jack found himself sitting beside a cooking fire, surrounded by Apache warriors who'd become increasingly comfortable in his presence throughout the day. The language barrier hadn't proven as difficult as expected, Many of the men spoke some English learned through trading or contact with the army, and Jack's own vocabulary of Apache words was growing rapidly. Mangus, the scarred warrior who'd spoken in Jack's favor earlier, was teaching him the proper way to prepare and share Apache bread, a skill that required patience and precise timing. Like tracking deer, Mangus explained in halting English, his weathered hands shaping the dough with practiced ease. Cannot rush, must feel when ready. Nalnish sat beside Jack, translating the more complex parts of the conversation and adding his own commentary. The boy had transformed throughout the day from a starving waif into a confident child surrounded by loving family. His eyes sparkled with life and his laugh rang out frequently as the warriors told stories designed to amuse him. "Uncle Mangus, tell Jack about the time you caught 3 horses with 1 rope," Nalnish said in English, then repeated the request in Apache. Mangus grinned, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco and coffee traded from Mexican settlements. Through a combination of words and elaborate gestures, he began recounting a tale of horsemanship that seemed impossible until other warriors chimed in to confirm its truth. Jack found himself laughing despite himself, drawn into the warmth of these men's fellowship. Chief Nate approached the fire as the story wound down, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled better than anything Jack had tasted in months. He handed one to Jack and settled beside him with the easy grace of a man comfortable in any setting. "You've been quiet since the sun began setting," the chief observed. "The weight of decision grows heavier?" Jack sipped the coffee, savoring its strength and warmth. "I've been alone for 7 years," he said finally. "Got used to making decisions for one person, answering to nobody, caring about nobody. This ... He gestured around the circle of warriors. "This changes everything." "Does it frighten you?" Chief Ney asked without judgment. "Yes," Jack admitted, "and that surprises me. I've faced down claim jumpers, survived Apache raids, fought in the war. But the idea of belonging somewhere again, of having people depend on me and me depending on them ... double quotes, he shook his head. "That scares me more than any gun." Nalnish looked up at him with those wise dark eyes. "I was scared too," the boy said quietly. "When Mexican men killed my family, when I was alone in desert, scared to trust anyone again. But you showed me sometimes being scared together is better than being safe alone." The wisdom of the child's words hit Jack like a revelation. He'd spent 7 years choosing safety over connection, isolation over the risk of loss. But what kind of life was that, really? What was safety worth if it meant living without purpose, without people to care about? Chief Nate seemed to sense the direction of Jack's thoughts. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The offer we've made, it's not just words spoken in gratitude. If you choose to stay with us, you become truly one of us. You would share our dangers as well as our protection." "What do you mean?" The chief's expression grew grave. "The same Mexican slavers who killed Nalnish's family are moving north. They have a large force, maybe 200 men, and they're hunting Apache to sell in the slave markets of Sonora. Our scouts report they'll reach this territory within days." Around the fire, the other warriors had grown quiet, understanding the seriousness of what was being discussed, even if they couldn't follow all the English words. "If you ride away tomorrow, you'll be safe," Chief Nate continued. "They have no interest in lone cowboys. But if you stay with us, if you truly become our brother, then you share our enemies. The Mexicans won't distinguish between Apache and white when the fighting starts." Jack felt a cold clarity settle over him. This was the real choice, not just between loneliness and belonging, but between safety and standing up for what was right. The Mexican slavers were the same kind of evil that had destroyed his own family during the war, the same brutality that preyed on the innocent and defenseless. "How many warriors do you have?" Jack asked, "Counting the men here and those protecting our families. Perhaps 300 fighting men," Mangus answered in English, having followed enough of the conversation to understand. "Against 200 slavers." "The numbers favor us," Chief Nate acknowledged. But they have better weapons, newer rifles bought with slaver gold. And they fight with the desperation of men who know they'll be hanged if captured by either Apache or American authorities. Jack stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker like the thoughts racing through his mind. 7 years ago, he'd sworn never to fight again, never to risk caring enough about anything to put his life on the line for it. But here was Nalnish, alive because Jack had chosen compassion over indifference. Here were these warriors, offering him brotherhood because they recognized something good in his character that he'd forgotten existed. "There's more," Chief Nate said quietly. "If we defeat these slavers, if we drive them back across the border, it could mean peace between our peoples, at least in this territory. The Army knows these Mexicans are a threat to American settlements, too. A victory here could open talks, could end the cycle of raid and revenge that's destroying both our peoples." The weight of possibility settled on Jack's shoulders. This wasn't just about one man's choice between solitude and community, it was about the chance to make a real difference, to fight for something meaningful instead of just surviving day to day. Nalnish reached over and touched Jack's arm. "Whatever you choose, you always be my friend," the boy said seriously. "You gave me life when I was dying. That never changes." Jack looked around the circle of faces lit by firelight, men who'd fought for their families, their culture, their very survival. Men who'd seen enough of his character in one act of kindness to offer him a place among them. Men who were asking him not just to join them, but to stand with them against a real evil that threatened everything they held dear. "If I stay," Jack said slowly, "if I choose to stand with you, what would that look like? How does a white cowboy become an Apache warrior?" Chief Nate smiled, and Jack saw approval in the older man's eyes. "The same way an Apache boy becomes a man through courage, through loyalty, through proving that honor matters more than fear." Mangus leaned forward, speaking in Apache to the chief, then switching to English directed at Jack. "He says you already prove this. Man who shares last food with enemy child, that man already has warrior heart." As the fire burned lower and the desert stars emerged overhead, Jack Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his life. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't safe, but it was right, and for the first time in 7 years, that was enough. "I'll stay," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I'll stand with you." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors around the fire erupted in approval, speaking rapidly in Apache, clapping Jack on the shoulders, welcoming him not as an outsider but as a brother. Nalnish threw his small arms around Jack's neck, tears of joy streaming down his face. Chief Nate gripped Jack's hand in the firm clasp of equals. "Tomorrow, we ride to meet the slavers," he said. "Tonight, we celebrate gaining a brother worth 500 men." As the celebration continued around him, Jack felt something he'd thought lost forever, the feeling of being home. Not a place on a map, but a bond forged by honor and choice, strengthened by the willingness to fight for something greater than himself. The lonely cowboy who'd shared his last meal with a starving child had found his way back to the human family, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing death alone, it's choosing to live and fight alongside others who share your values. In 3 days, the battle with the Mexican slavers would test every man's resolve. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, Jack Morrison was no longer alone.